Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 15.1 top lane tier list. So for content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. It was a big patch. We saw a bunch of changes towards the game overall, with a bunch of system changes, item changes, some champion changes. We have a new objective in Atakan, and then there's a lot of other systems and stuff which has moved around. So let's get into it. The D tier is going to consist of some new faces, but mostly the ones returning from the previous patch. The likes of Smolder has basically fizzled out of the top lane completely. The only matchup which I'd ever really recommend considering this champion into is Cassante and utilizing Smolder as like a flex pick. Other than that, he's probably just going to be dropped completely from the top lane. He's had his time, and the changes to which he received to nerf his wave clear down have definitely kind of pushed him out of the top lane role at this point. Yasuo has been underperforming this patch. He seems to have not benefited as well with some of the feats changes, combined with, I believe, Zerkagreaves' feats upgrade being the weakest of the options, Swifties being the strongest. He's really just not benefited a huge amount from a lot of the changes, and he drops down to the D tier now. Udyr, also going to be within the D tier. One of the big changes this patch towards top lane itemization is Unending Despair got gutted. That item is a lot worse than it was in the previous patch, where it was overpowered, probably the best item which you could have accessible to you if you could really opt into it. We even saw the likes of Unending Despair Jace towards the end of last patch, but Udyr really needed that item to kind of function in the top lane. You do have Leandries as a secondary option. That can be something which you opt into, but you lose your tankiness, your going to definitely have to go down a different route to really make this champion work, and his popularity is really quite aggressively declined within the top lane. Jace is the final champion within the D tier. It's funny watching the way the Jace builds went from last patch to this patch. Last patch, it was like this gradual move towards tank Jace as being like, it's pretty good. It's a solid option alongside the already pre-existing lethality AD hybrid Jace build. This patch, obviously, it's really bad. You don't really want to be playing it anymore. In the previous patch, it was good into like melee compositions where they didn't really have the burst damage to kill you, and you kind of wanted a bit more durability to survive, and you can make use of the items which you're building, which was like Unending Despair, Thimble, Winter Spirits. This patch, it's just not great. It's really struggling quite a bit more. I'd recommend trying the likes of Youmuu's if you're looking for an alternative build, but Jace, until he moves off of this, kind of like the Vladimir Grasp WMAX stuff beforehand, is going to linger within the D tier. I imagine as people move on, he will move back up to the C tier, though he still does underperform in the top lane, especially within mid-elo, which is what this tier list is trying to encapsulate. Rumble leads off the C tier. The interesting item, the other really interesting item is Bloodletter's Curse and how that impacts some of the AP bruiser mages within the top lane. Rumble doesn't want it. Rumble doesn't need pen. He has built-in pen on his E, which allows him to forego and skip these items. So he's just not someone who's really going to look at it as a great option. However, he does underperform for average elos. He's a very elite skewed AP champion, which kind of builds around his early game harass, his ability to like poke without drawing minion aggro, and like wave manipulation. That's what a lot of Rumble's strengths comes down to. Just not something I'm going to hugely recommend here, but if you are comfortable on him and you want to translate him higher up along with a lot of the other picks on this list, you can definitely make him work. So he does sit within the C tier, a tier above the ones within the D tier. Cassante, I think, is a great tank in the top lane. He's obviously a lot harder to pilot, which is what prohibits him from really climbing the tiers. He's also very early game skewed, and when games early on into the season tend to be a bit messy, and people usually struggle closing, albeit this season's a bit different with the First Blood feat mechanic. A lot of people are actually just FFing games at 15 minutes because it feels really bad to play from that kind of situation where not only are you down First Blood, but you are also down a feat, and then usually snowballing towards multiple feats, whether that's like your objectives or your tower. Like if enemy top laner, if ally top laner gets slain, and then they're allowed to siege onto that turret, you can lose your feet pretty quickly in like 10 to 14 minutes, and it could be really rough for your team because you are now playing at quite a heavy disadvantage. So it's just something to be cognitive of, especially when playing early and late game champions, what kind of mental your team has towards these kind of picks. But Cassante, traditionally very good in elite and competitive. For average play though, tends to be a bit on the weaker side, kind of akin to Rumble. He does sit within the C tier at the moment. Silas is back to being running a conditional counter pick. Malphite, Gnar, and Yone, I believe, are the 3 matchups which you tend to be able to pick him into in the top lane. Malphite, obviously, for the ultimate. Gnar, also for the ultimate. I believe he just wins the Yone matchup, especially when Yone isn't in amazing of a spot at the moment. So, yeah, Sylas going to be within the C tier. Now, Swain, primarily good as an anti-tank. Obviously, they struggle to kill him within lane, allow him to freely stack, maintain his ability to stay within the fights for longer, as they just don't have the burst damage to take him down. That is where his real strength lies. He will struggle against practically every other top laner though, so not a pick I'm really going to recommend outside of, like, once again, counter picks, kind of akin to the likes of Sylas. Victor, I'd recommend the Blackfire Torch Leandry's variant with, like, your Summonary and then, like, your Bone Plating, Shield Bash secondary, unless you're in a free matchup, and obviously Presence and Legend Haste work as really nice secondary options. He's fine as a top lane option. He can kite out a lot of the bruisers into champions which can, like, get onto him and punish him for not having any sort of dash. He can really struggle in most situations. The likes of Yone and Aurelia are, like, common mid examples of things which can punish him. But there will be other examples in the top lane, and if enemy top lane is running Ghost or has some movement, then it can be quite hard for Victor to play against them. Into some AD matchups like Set and Darius, you might be able to get away with, like, a Grasp Iceborne rush build. That has been something we've seen a bit, but he does sit towards the mid-low C tier at the moment, in my opinion, for the top lane. Gwen, Fiora, and Yone and GP, all these champions, if you can pilot them well, really do scale quite, scale with skill. If you're not comfortable on them, though, they're just not picks I'm really going to recommend. Fiora, Gwen, obviously your traditional anti-tanks. Yone's actually pretty good into tank matchups as well. When you're going, like, Bork, it can be quite hard for them to kill him, and he'll oftentimes just out-stat check them in the 1v1s. GP, if you can play it, is very good still. But traditionally, most people struggle piloting this pick to its full extent, or even half of its extent, honestly. Like, if you're not rotating barrels effectively, this champion loses a huge amount of its value and becomes more of a Q harass bot in lane, and then, like, an ult as a fallback pattern and wave clearer later on. Overall, yeah, these picks scale really well. Like, the higher ranks you go and the more mastery you have in them, just picks I'm not going to really recommend more for the average player base. Nasus has had a bit of a fall from grace. He was in my A tier, I believe, in the previous patch, but a lot of the split pushers seem to be on the, just not doing as well at the moment. I believe the new objective combined with some of the other system changes within the game have actually hurt their playstyle quite aggressively. So, like, your Nasuses, your Trundles, your Alawi to an extent, your Yoriks are all a bit weaker. So, yeah, Nasus probably has had one of the more egregious drop-offs and will probably get buffed at some point soon. But, yeah, he now sits as, like, a C-tier option. We have Quinn here, still remains as a C-tier pick, didn't really change that much with the new season. Obviously, if you can get a snowball going and you can, like, continue to fly around the map and burst people down utilizing, like, a Profane Hydra and Electrocute build variant, then she can be valuable within that aspect. But overall, as a top laner, she struggles ever really finding those isolated 1v1s. She just doesn't have the damage which she had in the past, and most top laners can opt into, like, D-Shield, Second Wind, and just resist her for the most part. And as long as your team is aware, then she will never really get that, like, movement or the snowball she wants across the map. Vayne is still a very solid option into some of the tanks and champions which can't really punish her for her, like, mobility and her ability to kind of just walk up and trade into them. Against certain champions, she can definitely struggle a lot more. Champions which can burst her, champions which can just not really allow her to get in range without really punishing, or without her being punished by, like, minion damage or, like, counter abilities. That is where Vayne's biggest weakness lie, but I still think she's a very viable C-tier option, especially in specific matchups. Pantheon still sits within the C tier. I'm not a huge fan of the champion in its current state. I think it's slightly limited by its inability to really scale and really dependent, really heavy dependence on snowballing laning phase. If you can snowball laning phase, then yeah, this champion can be quite valuable. It doesn't egregiously fall off into the late game as long as you have the gold. If you don't have the gold, then yeah, this champion feels worthless a lot of the time and just becomes like an E point and click CC bot, and hoping you can, like, maybe get onto a marksman with flash to utilize your full combo. But yeah, Pantheon sits within the C tier at the moment. And Sion's actually dropped all the way from the A tier to the C tier. This champion really does not seem to have found its footing this patch for The changes to Heartsteel, albeit helped certain champions with really high health pools rather than like bonus HP pools. Sion doesn't seem to have really benefited as much as I believed he would. First Item Rush, it still looks slightly weaker than some of his other options. Obviously, Sion as a champion has had alternate builds for a while. Like, you've had variants where you can pick up like Titanic, Xerx, Overlord Bloodmail. You've had Lethality variants. You've had like hybrid tank variants. Overall, though, he does look to be a bit weaker at the moment, though, so he does drop down to the C tier. You can make him work, though. Like, if you understand the champion and what you need within the game, there are definitely ways to, like, have him function. But yeah, Unending Despair looking a lot weaker really hurts it as a second item on Sion. Garen, still very popular in low elo. His champion is definitely a bit weaker than he has been in the past, especially last split. Like, Garen was weak for the most part over last split, but he sits as like a B2 option at the moment. You can definitely make him work into the things like Jax and some of the other champions, which are a bit more vulnerable to his E, and like the silence really punishes them for what they want to do. He sits as more like a B tier option at the moment. Next to him, we have Jax. Jax is definitely doing a bit worse at the moment. The champion's really suffered from his previous nerfs, and I believe you could even consider him as possibly a C tier option. But there is definitely value to this pick. He still has great flank potential with Counter-Strike. He can scale relatively well. His laning phase isn't weak by any means. You can definitely make him work into specific matchups which are really punished by Counter-Strike, but he's definitely not as strong as he has been in the past, so he does sit as like a B tier option at the moment. And Bessa moves up from the C tier to the B tier. She's definitely benefited from people getting more mastery on the champion and like changing up runes and build options. We've seen like Shojin Cyclosword variants, which have definitely done quite well into specific matchups, but like Eclipse still works very nicely as a default option. Grasp seems to be a very solid keystone option on her, but she can run the likes of Electrocute and Conqueror, still both work very nicely on her. She abuses Sudden Impact really well, being able to get that on like most of her abilities, as they all are considered as dashes. So there's definitely strength to this champion, and I believe as you put more mastery into it, she should definitely scale up, especially into the higher ranks. I do think this champion's quite good, but she does struggle into the likes of Renekton, so that is just something you have to be quite cognitive of. Trundle, his play is also a bit weaker, so I think I had him in the A tier last patch as like a low A tier option. He does drop down to the B tier now. Still good as like a static AD option. He's very easy to play, so if that's what you're looking for, he can still definitely function here. I'd have him slightly above Nasus at the moment, but he still has his vulnerabilities, and if he falls behind, he can feel very hard to play within the game. Alawi, I'm not a huge fan of this champion as well at the moment. She got nerfed by free base AD at some point last split. I believe it was right near the beginning, and she was fine for the most part, but going into this split, she's definitely been on a bit of a weaker side, really struggling into matchups like Mordekaiser, who is still a very popular champion at the moment, the third most popular top laner in Gold Plus. So yeah, she's definitely doing a bit worse. Actually, no, I'll be like all ranks, Mordekaiser being the third most popular. So Alawi sits as like a B tier option. Varus might be a surprise to a lot of people. I have him here primarily on the basis that Ginsu's Hullbreaker Varus looks incredibly good at the moment and definitely worth trying. If you don't do that, I think he still sits as like a C, possibly even D tier pick. And maybe not as low as D tier actually. It sits as more like a C tier pick. But yeah, Varus, I would say he's probably underrated by a lot of people at the moment, and hopefully when people like pick up the build and try some of the other things on him, especially with the changes he received this patch, really helping WMAX as like an option on him, he should really like thrive as like a B tier option. Rice sits within the B tier. I've actually dropped him from the A tier. He's just doing a little bit worse this patch, so yeah, I've just knocked him down a peg. He's still a solid option, especially if you pilot him well. It can work really nicely into the likes of the Kennen matchup. Gragas, great as a neutralizer, can have decent amount of harass and laning phase to the point where he can like get kill threat, but he tends to be a bit harder to pilot and really finds his footing in Elite, which is why I'd really recommend playing him. But if you're good at piloting him, he is still in a very strong spot, so definitely sits as more like a high B tier, or mid to high B tier option. Tryndamere is obviously still really unhealthy. I still really dislike the build in its current state, but there's no doubt that it is still very functional at the moment. This is the Ravenous Hydra, like D-Shield Second Wind, basically immortal and unsiegeable Tryndamere, which is kind of reliant on either just RNGing you early onto the game, just to make him basically unassailable, or kind of just sitting back, just being on sides and waiting for people to make a bad macro play to really punish you, take your towers, and yeah, play through that. I don't think it's exactly what's the word I'm looking for? It's not what I would consider an interactive playstyle, but if you do enjoy Tryndamere, then he can definitely like get you wins at the moment. Aurora, incredibly good elite pick, probably one of the top 3 top laners in elite at the moment. Really does struggle quite a bit more in average play. Tends to be a bit weaker of a laner, but if you get the gold, then she can really like snowball off that. Like getting a Ludens can make this champion feel incredibly unfair to play against, because she has good mobility and yeah, good range to really kite out most of the top lane pool. So I really do recommend like giving her a try, and if you do feel comfortable on her, she can definitely be a pick which really gets you through the ranks in this early split. Poppy, definitely doing a lot worse at the moment. The champion, we shifted over to the Sundered Sky build, which is good because Sundered Sky benefited from the 10% Q80 ratio buff, which she received in the previous patch. However, you should still look to go for tank build in the games you need it. I'd recommend trying out some like Iceborne variations when you have like when you need that additional armor. Unending Despair looks like a considerably worse option on her at the moment, but it's still something you can go, especially later on to the build. So try like Sundered Sky into Fimbulwinter. You tend to really do value that tier early on into the game, which is why you end up going like a Fimbulwinter. And then things like Unending Despair, Spirits, Iceborne. These are all options which can fit as like 3rd, 4th slot items. Other than that, like Full Mail can be quite nice, but I'd still recommend sitting in Bramble oftentimes if you are looking towards that Full Mail later on into the game. But she's not performing as well at the moment, so I do have her as a B tier option. Still really good into Argot though, which is frustrating, but what can you do? Vladimir also sits within the beta. He's actually gradually risen back up as like a solid top laner again, which is funny because obviously he was really heavily dragged down by the Grasp W Max for a long while. If you pick him in the correct matchups, he can feel really hard to ever assail. Like, this champion has a good amount of safety, pretty high movement speed, and his range does make him quite oppressive. Into bad matchups, Vladimir can feel really like uncomfortable, and it can be really hard to find the resources you need within the game, especially if you ever get zoned off waves, or you're just not able to find the advantages you really need, or the kill threat which you really want. There are like multiple build variations, but like the main two are like your Cosmic into like standard AP, or your Storm Surge into more burst standard AP. I'd recommend trying out what you feel comfortable on and what you need within the game. Oftentimes, obviously, burst builds are going to be better in games where most of the targets are squishy. But yeah, Vladimir, I'd have him as a solid B2 option. He can be quite polarizing in specific matchups, but can definitely struggle if you're just blinding him every game. Maokai doing a lot worse, and Unending Despair really hurt this champion quite a bit. He was really inflated off this item. Like, the win rate was something like 3% higher in the previous patch off this specific item. The changes have, really hurt him. Obviously, there are still builds where you could go like Spirits Rush and into like an Unending, especially into like AP matchup. So he's not dead in the water. I still think this champion can definitely be viable into specific matchups, but he's no longer really blindable. He just doesn't function like that anymore, and it's unfortunate because, I like Maokai. And he's easy to play, so he's always a champion I'd really recommend, but he now sits as a B2 option. Mundo also doing a lot worse at the moment. I think Mundo will actually get buffed, especially if they go through with his Heartstone nerf, which they threw on PPE, which is surprising because I don't think the item's stronger than it was before. I think it's neutral, if anything, maybe even slightly weaker. Warmogs, however, looks pretty good as a 2nd, 3rd, 4th item on Mundo, so he does scale equally as well, but his viability in high elo is basically gone. He's so much weaker early on into the game, especially on like a 1-2 item spike compared to where he used to be at. So yeah, he drops down to the B tier now. In lower elos though, you can still make this champion work, and if you can get to like your level 16, 17, 18, he is basically immortal. Shen drops all the way down to the B tier as well, another champion which I really like. I think this pick lost a lot of value with Unending Despair being nerfed. It was like the build my build, which I always recommended, was Heartstone Unending Despair. It made you very unassailable. You oftentimes got enough gold to get these 2 items, and then you could wrap it out with like a spirit. Shen obviously doesn't get as much gold because he tends to be a bit more around the map. You're dropping waves a bit more because he just doesn't have the wave clear, nor does he really have the sieging potential, but he's definitely doing a lot worse at the moment, so he does drop down to the B tier in his current state. And then Renekton wraps it up. This champion is fine. I still think you can definitely make him work, and he's still like the jack of all trades top laner, which is funny because like I'd recommend trying the Trinity Force Youmuu's builds. I think it's pretty solid actually. So this is the 3-in-1 variant where you go like QW max, you run jack of all trades, and then you go Trinity, defensive boots, Youmuu's, and then I believe Grudge as your 3rd item, and then is it Grudge? Yeah, I think it's Grudge, and then you go Edge or Bork as like 4th, and you can kind of flex around from there. Anyway, I'd recommend checking out 3-in-1. He's a really good Renekton player. I have him in the beta at the moment, but he does rise a decent amount the higher up you go because he serves more of a purpose in elite and higher elos. Moving on to the A tier then, we lead off with Aatrox. So I still think it's a pretty solid champion, especially the Shojin Voltaic Cyclosword build. You could say he's interchangeable with Renekton. I'm not gonna argue that. Like, I think both these, I think actually a lot of the B tier and A tier could be interchangeable depending like on whether you have mastery on them or just personal opinion. But yeah, Aatrox gonna be in the A tier. I believe one of his build variants is pretty good, but you still have the standard build variation, which is quite nice. Malphite could arguably be dropped down to the B tier. I think this champion struggles a bit more at the moment. He's obviously very conditional. You can't really pick this champion early on into the draft. You have to wait until like B4, B5, R5 is like and being able to pick him. Otherwise, you'll just end up getting counterpicked by Silas, and then this champion becomes a nuisance to have within your team. But he still sits as like a solid. And you know, I'll drop him down to the B tier. I think he's just too conditional. I think he really, really could benefit with being slightly stronger to really enable him to kind of be the purpose of what he wants. Like, he should really most likely win the games he is picked in if he is picked in good spots. So yeah, Malphite gonna drop down to the B tier. Set I'm going to have within the A tier. This champion's doing alright again. That's just mostly going to be a lot of these low A, high B tier options there. Fine champions, they can function really well if you have good mastery on them, good understanding, pick them in good spots. They're not the creme de la creme, and they're not like bad by any means, so I'd say he's just good. Set works nicely with like a stride breaker, and then you can kind of flex on some of the other bruiser options, whether that's like your whole breakers. We've seen like Shojin variants, Sterix variants, Overlord Blood Mills variants, so he says it's a solid A tier option. Yorick got a bit weaker this patch, but he's still incredibly dominant in low elo, so it's kind of hard to really drop him out of the A tier. I'd say he sits as more like a low A tier option now. If he was like a close to S tier in the previous patch, I might have even had him in the S tier, but yeah, now sits as more like a low A tier option. Gnar has had a pretty good rise for the average player base. Gnar has always been really good in elite, and I think this champion might be one of the premier picks going into competitive for next split, so definitely watch that space. I might make a high elo top lane tier list video this week if I'm not like really busy, because I do have to work as well, unfortunately. But yeah, Gnar sits as like an A tier pick. I will talk about him maybe a high elo tier list for this week or next week or next patch, depending on when I find the time to do it. But yeah, Gnar sits a solid A tier pick. Riven also moves back up to the A tier, but really benefited from some of the system changes this patch. Really wants to look for those first blood angles, get those feats of strength, and then translate that into advantages and then snowballing game states. I still think she's not very approachable for the average player, unless you put a lot of time into her and you really like learn the mechanics of the champion, kind of akin to Aurelia. But I think these two champions are doing really well at the moment, which is why I have Riven in this case in the A tier. I'll talk about Aurelia in a second. Camille doing a bit better as well. I think Camille really benefits from some of the matchups which got a bit weaker. She like can fight a bit more against them. She side lanes quite well, albeit it seems to be a bit weaker at the moment. She has good isolated pick potential, and some of the lane matchups are just a bit better for her. So she does sit as an A tier champion. The overall general consensus is a lot of champions which didn't really get touched are just a bit stronger now because of some of the champions getting considerably weaker within the top lane. Mostly tanks. There are some outliers towards the tank pool which are doing a bit better at the moment, but yeah, Camille sits as more like an A tier option. Ornn and Cho'Gath, I'll have Cho'Gath and Ornn a bit separate. In Ornn's case, he is doing a bit worse. Once again, another champion which lost a bit with Unending Despair being a bit weaker, but he can still definitely function as a solid tank option. Some of the ones which rush Sunfires a lot of the time are still doing relatively well, like Zac, for example. Champion's not really dependent on heart still, which, yeah, they don't really benefit from, especially because they have not as high HP pools as like your Scions and your Cho'Gaths, for example, or don't scale as aggressively with health ratios. And in this case, yeah, he sits as a solid A tier pick. Like I say solid, as like a low A tier pick. I still think this champion ends up being a bit dependent on teammates at the end of the day, and is probably not the greatest way to climb, especially if you are looking to win most of your games. But he's there. He's the good old reliable. Actually, I'll have him here. Singed is niche. Honestly, I'll put all like some of the niche A tier ones towards the end. So we have Singed, we have Kled, we have Heimerdinger, we have Wukong. All these picks are good if you pilot them well. If you don't have the comfort on them, those picks you're probably just going to ignore. In Wukong's case, it looks like a Trinity Profane Hydra 2-item core. Works quite nice on him. With Grasp and Sudden Impact, he seems to be pretty strong in the top lane at the moment, especially into some of the AD matchups where you can really make use of his passive. Singed's case, he always has a good, like, okay, so Singed and Kayle are two champions which always, without fail, have good win rates at the beginning of seasons, mostly because they benefit from, like, certain, like, behavior patterns which, like, players tend to inhibit, like, early on, and that's, like, the game's going longer, and games just being more chaotic, and these two champions kind of thrive off one of these two things. So Singed's case, his win rate's a bit higher at the moment. It'll probably go down, but yeah, definitely sits as like an A tier option for the most part all the time because of his nicheness of playstyle and his like relatively decently sized player base. Kled, obviously, a bit more niche as well. Very aggressive early game scoot champion, wants to be able to snowball and just like take his advantages into tower dives. Obviously, tower diving is a bit harder this patch, but he drops aggro with the dismount. Albeit the tower duration damage lingers for longer, so he probably can't re-engage even out of like going into mini. So that is just something you probably should be a bit more cognitive of. And Heimerdinger, he's a very obnoxious champion with his wave clear, and his burst damage is very, very unexpected a lot of the time. He's not the highest tier by any means, but he's a good champion. I really do recommend more people try out Heimerdinger, and I'm glad that like Arcane brought some new players towards this champion. Akali is underrated. I think Akali moves up to the A tier as a top laner. I think this champion has a good amount of matchup pools within the top lane, has solid itemization at the moment. You can opt into Electrocute or Conqueror. You can go like Liandry, maybe not Protobelt, Liandry, or why can't I think of the other first item? Maybe it is Protobelt, or Storm Surge, I can't remember. No, Lichbane, that's the other one. There are like different I mean, honestly, you can rush most of these options, and she can work relatively well. She's in a solid spot at the moment, and I'd say Akali is definitely a champion I'd recommend you pick up, especially if you're a mid to top player, or even just as a top laner. She can work into like very specific matchups. Gwen, for example, is a matchup which I do recommend trying her into, unless you're me, and then it's just a disaster. Cho'Gath sits within the A tier. So Cho'Gath, benefited from Heartsteel. Yippee! He also benefited from Unending Despair being able to be picked up more as a later option. So Cho'Gath actually ended up being relatively neutral compared to a lot of the other tanks, which were a bit weaker. So definitely a champion I'd recommend trying if you like tanks, considering a lot of them are just a bit weaker at the moment. There are two others, which I'll talk about in a second, and Cassante is still Cassante, so if you want something to go into Elite, then he is an option there for you. But if you just want something for average play, Cho'Gath might be the pick for you. Olaf sits within my A tier. He's gradually climbed his way back up the tier list, kind of like Vladimir. Champion's really good into tanks and champions reliant on CC. He obviously struggles into the likes of Set, for example. Champions which can oftentimes fight back against him, or don't really need to interact with him that much within team fights and go for backline, or just ult him and then get access to backline without taking the Olaf with him. There are different ways that this interaction can go, but Olaf can struggle a bit more into those. But yeah, the CC matchups is where he really finds his footing, and he's doing a bit better at the moment. Genin sits within my A tier. He was within my B tier for a while, but I think this champion is slept on at the moment, so I'm going to push him up to the A tier. I might change my mind next patch. I'm just dropping back down to the B tier, but he's in a pretty good spot at the moment and can be quite a solid mid to elite pick, especially if you put the time into playing him. He has a lot of harass, he has a lot of burst damage, he's a great team fighting ultimate. He's a pretty good all-rounder, so if you're looking for an AP champion within the top lane, then Genin could probably be the champion for you. What else have we got here? Darius and Teemo. So Teemo is doing pretty well at the moment. Once again, he's another champion which I recommend people try Bloodletter's Curse on. It might not be very good long term, and like that item might need to be buffed. It doesn't look to be like any sort of like out of the ordinary numbers at the moment, so it's probably just fine, but yeah, he's definitely doing quite well at the moment, so he does sit within my A tier. In Darius's case, he's really shot up in pick rate this patch. He is by far and away the most popular top laner in the game, I'm pretty sure. I can check. He's pretty popular, yeah, like 6k more games in Gold Plus than Aatrox, so definitely doing quite well for himself, and yeah, he seems to be a bit stronger, so Darius goes up to the A tier. Once again, he's a champion which can really benefit from getting those first bloods to guarantee a stack of feet. What else? So Kayle. Okay, so Kayle is the other one. Kayle always, without fails, goes up at the beginning of seasons and splits because games go longer. So Kayle really benefits from that. She's also doing a bit better at the moment. She received a couple of buffs over last split, which really did help her kind of re-find her footing, because she was weak for the most part, like the previous split and going into the beginning of last split. And yeah, this season, I think she's a high A tier option. I'll keep monitoring her. There's a chance she could even move up to the S tier if some other champions get nerfed and she doesn't. Or she could find herself towards the mid to low A tier. But she's definitely doing a lot better at the moment, so I would have her as an A tier option. Warwick and Volibear doing a bit worse, so he dropped from the S tier down to the A tier. Warwick obviously received a buff, and then a nerf, and then another nerf, and now he sits as being fine. This champion, I mean, he's a bit better than fine. He's a really good early game aggressive champion, kind of like Darius, can really like get those snowballs going and be quite oppressive to play against. Warwick very clearly falls off though, struggles in team fights, not the greatest on side if in 1v2 scenarios, but can, yeah, still 1v1 most champions later on to the game. That is where his strength really does lie. You do want to be ahead of the curve though. Like, if this champion falls behind, he feels pretty bad, so that is just something to be cognitive of. In Volibear's case, he's still a very easy and simplistic champion to understand. He loves to be able to dive. His ultimate is an incredibly powerful tool for that, and with the tower damage being a bit heavier, that can definitely help, especially if you want to drop aggro in amongst that. I don't know specifically off the top of my head what the duration of Volibear ult is on towers. I believe it's 1.5 to 2.5, but it might be something slightly different. It might be 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. I don't remember. Anyway, yeah, Volibear doing a bit worse this patch, but still good, so I'd have him as like a high A2 option. And then my S tier picks, I have 6 of them. So I'll leave with Cassiopeia. This champion's incredibly good in the top lane, has been for a long time. It's just kind of niche and a bit, I don't want to say gimmicky. I think she should be played a lot more here. It's kind of like Azir top, except from a bit more mainstream. Like, Azir top's actually really good, and people don't really know that, and should really be playing it in a lot more situations. Albeit Azir's quite a hard champion, a lot harder than Cassiopeia. I still think Cassiopeia is hard though, because of some of the things you like and differences she has towards a lot of the top lane pool. Anyway, I digress. Cassiopeia, yeah, great top laner at the moment. Kites out a lot of the bruisers, can oftentimes just DPS them down, can fix team comps in terms of what they need, especially if like you need a DPS AP top laner. She can be great for that, especially if like you have a tank jungler or an AD jungler, for example. So yeah, I'd say she's a good S tier pick at the moment. Zac once again finds himself within the S tier. He didn't get hit as hard as some of the other tanks, so he kind of just takes their spot, if anything. I still think he's weaker than what he has been in the past, but he kind of rises up where others have fallen down a bit. Aurelia might be the most surprising S2 option for like an average elo tier list. She is just overpowered at the moment. That's simply it. Her numbers are just too high, and that gives her enough strength to push herself into the S tier. Even if she is a mechanically demanding champion, I think this pick can still function lower down, not like the lowest ranks. Like, you're not going to really find a huge amount of success with Aurelia in gold, especially if you're like first time with a champion. But if you put the games in and you learn the champion well, she can be a great pick to really translate and like carry you through all the ranks and even into high elo. Like, she's an incredibly good pick at the moment, so definitely worth learning, especially if you enjoy that kind of playstyle. If you don't enjoy it and you're not really feeling like comfortable on it, you don't need to play it. Like, she's not necessary, but she is an incredibly strong spot at the moment. So the people who do play it will have a bit more of an advantage with it. And then the remaining 3 top laners from the previous patch are Mordekaiser, who is probably my recommended AP bruiser option, Urgot, who is my recommended AD bruiser option, and Tahm Kench, who is a bit weaker when you play him as a standard tank, but the Riftmaker build is still really good, so definitely recommend trying that one out. That is Heartsteel, Riftmaker, Faker, Protobelt, Rabadon, and then you can kind of flex last slot. You'll probably hold on to a Dark Seal. You can also just play him as like a hybrid AP tank. Like you can go Riftmaker into like standard tank, but I think it's more funny just going like the Protobelt and just flying at someone and doing an absurd amount of damage. Like the champion's in a pretty solid spot still. It wouldn't surprise me if he got nerfed again, because he is a pretty hot topic at the moment, especially when he when like clips kept surfacing of him of doing completely ridiculous things like one-shotting Jinx under the tower. I know, it's funny. But yeah, he's just like an S tier option still, so yeah, you can definitely make him work. And then yeah, Urgot is my current pick of the patch. I mean, I play him. I think this champ's incredibly strong at the moment. Even better than average play, where you can oftentimes achieve what you want to do even better. Like you want that level 13 to 15 spike as soon as possible. He does an absurd amount of damage, especially if you play the build which I play at the moment, which is Cleaver, Hubris, I can't remember the build anymore. Cleaver, Hubris, Edge of Night, Steric, GA. Try those 5 items. It's incredibly fun. It's incredibly oppressive to play against. Like for the enemy, you do an absurd amount of damage, relatively tanky still, and I'd say he's in a really good spot at the moment. Mordekaiser, another champion which could maybe opt into Bloodletter's Curse, but obviously has the built-in magic penetration percentage, so it's not going to be as good, but it's definitely something there for him. I wouldn't be surprised if the item gets buffed at some point. Maybe Mordekaiser gets nerfed because they are concerned about it, but he's in a great spot at the moment, so no need to fear about that. He's going into tanks. A lot of champions just can't really ever match up to him in his ultimate and can't really escape him, especially when he's like sat on a Rhyolite, for example. And I'd say he's a really good S tier pick at the moment. So those are my thoughts. Recommend trying out the S tier, seeing what really makes it work for you. A lot of the tanks are a lot weaker at the moment, so I'd recommend trying to like move on to other tanks or moving on to other classes, especially because like your Maokais and Mundos just aren't going to be the same level of 3 ALP they were in the previous patch, especially lower down. They do struggle a decent amount more. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.